Think about this for a second. The most powerful nation on Earth, the country that would go on to build the largest intelligence apparatus in human history, had no centralized spy agency until 1947. No CIA, no covert operations bureau, no cloak and dagger institution pulling the strings behind the curtain. For over 170 years, from the founding of the Republic to the middle of the 20th century, America was essentially making it up as it went along when it came to espionage. And yet, during that time, the country fought a revolution against the world's greatest empire, survived a civil war that nearly ripped it in half, entered 2 world wars, and became a global superpower. So, if there was no CIA, no formal intelligence service, who exactly was doing the spying? Who was intercepting the letters, cracking the codes, running the agents, and feeding battlefield commanders the secrets they needed to win wars? The answer is stranger, messier, and far more fascinating than most people realize, because America's intelligence history before 1947 is not a story of professionals. It is a story of amateurs, con men, private detectives, obsessive code breakers, brilliant women who history tried to forget, and one Wall Street lawyer who was crazy enough to build a spy agency from scratch in the middle of the deadliest war the world had ever seen. This is the hidden history of American espionage, a history that most people have never heard, and one that explains exactly why the CIA had to exist. Let us go all the way back to where it began, and I mean the very beginning, the American Revolution. Now, most people think of the Revolutionary War as a story about muskets and bayonets, about George Washington crossing the Delaware, about freezing winters at Valley Forge. And all of that is true, but there is another dimension to that war, one that rarely makes it into the textbooks, and it is arguably the dimension that won the whole thing: espionage. George Washington understood something that many of his contemporaries did not. He knew that with a smaller, less experienced, less equipped army, the only way to beat the British was to know what they were going to do before they did it. Intelligence was not just helpful, it was existential. And Washington, the man who legend says never told a lie, became America's first grand spy master. He lied constantly and brilliantly, using deception, disinformation, and covert operations to outmaneuver the most powerful military force on the planet. He had learned these skills during his earlier service in the French and Indian War, and he carried them forward into a revolution that demanded every possible advantage. But it did not start well. Early in the war, Washington made a desperate call for volunteers to spy behind British lines in New York City, which the British had seized and turned into their primary stronghold. A young Connecticut schoolteacher named Nathan Hale stepped forward. Hale was brave, patriotic, and idealistic. He was also completely untrained in espionage, with no cover story, no handler, and no escape plan. He walked straight into British-held territory, posing as a Dutch schoolteacher looking for work, gathered some information, and was almost immediately captured. The British hanged him on September 22nd, 1776. According to tradition, his last words were something along the lines of, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." It was a noble death, but it was also a catastrophic intelligence failure, one that taught Washington a painful but essential lesson. Enthusiasm alone does not make a spy. You need tradecraft, you need networks, you need operational security. And so Washington set about building exactly that. In November of 1778, Washington appointed a young cavalry officer named Benjamin Tallmadge as Director of Military Intelligence and ordered him to do something that had never been done before in American military history: build a functioning spy ring inside enemy-held New York City. Tallmadge was smart, disciplined, and deeply cautious, the opposite of the ill-fated Nathan Hale. And he drew his recruits not from the military, but from his childhood friends on Long Island, people he trusted with his life. There was Abraham Woodhull, a farmer who operated under the alias Samuel Culper Sr. There was Robert Townsend, a merchant and journalist who posed as a British loyalist while gathering intelligence in Manhattan's coffeehouses and taverns, operating under the alias Samuel Culper Jr. There was Caleb Brewster, who commanded whaleboats in the Long Island Sound, ferrying messages across the water under cover of darkness. There was Austin Rowe, tavern-keeper who made regular trips into New York under the pretense of buying supplies, but who was actually collecting intelligence and smuggling it out in invisible ink. And there was Anna Strong, who used her clothesline as a signaling system, hanging a black petticoat to indicate that a message was ready for pickup, and a specific number of white handkerchiefs to direct the courier to the right dead drop location. Washington himself suggested the name for this network, a play on Culpeper County in his home state of Virginia. It became known as the Culper Spy Ring, and it was, without exaggeration, the most effective intelligence operation on either side of the Revolutionary War. For 5 years, the ring operated without a single member being unmasked. Even Washington himself did not know the true identities of all the agents. A deliberate security measure designed by Talmadge to ensure that if one person was captured, they could not compromise the entire network. And the intelligence they provided was extraordinary. In 1780, the Culper Ring discovered that British General Henry Clinton was planning an expedition against French forces in Rhode Island. Talmadge got the information to Washington, who immediately ordered his army into an offensive position, forcing Clinton to cancel the attack entirely. The ring also played a crucial role in exposing the treason of Benedict Arnold, the American general who attempted to surrender the strategic fort at West Point to the British. It was through the ring's network that the British spy, Major John Andre, was apprehended, unraveling Arnold's entire plot. The Culper Ring pioneered techniques that would become staples of modern espionage. Invisible ink, developed by Dr. James Jay, the brother of founding father John Jay, was used to write secret messages directly onto regular correspondence, such as books or pamphlets. Only the sender and recipient could decipher the hidden text. The ring employed dead drops, coded correspondence using a numerical cipher where every important name, place, and concept was replaced by a number. Compartmentalized operations, where agents knew as little as possible about each other, signal systems, cutouts, and counter-surveillance techniques. Washington and Talmadge were essentially inventing the American intelligence playbook from scratch, and doing it under conditions of extraordinary danger. But here is what makes this story both remarkable and deeply telling. The moment the war ended, the whole thing evaporated. There was no effort to preserve the Culper Ring's methods, no attempt to build a permanent intelligence capability, no institutional memory whatsoever. The ring dissolved. Its members returned to their farms and shops. Washington went home to Mount Vernon. In 1790, long after the war had been won, President paid a visit to Austin Rowe's tavern meeting for the first time in person, one of his principal secret agents. It was a quiet acknowledgement of a debt that could never be publicly repaid, and America forgot that it had ever had an intelligence service at all. This pattern would repeat itself for over a century, and it reveals something fundamental about the American relationship with espionage. Americans, frankly, found the whole business distasteful. Spying was something that the corrupt monarchies of Europe did. It was underhanded, sneaky, and fundamentally at odds with the democratic ideals of the young republic. Real Americans fought their wars openly on the battlefield, face to face. That was the prevailing attitude, and it would cost the country dearly over and over again. Fast forward about 80 years to the American Civil War, and the pattern repeats with devastating consequences. When the war broke out in 1861, the Union had no centralized military intelligence agency. None. The Confederacy, for its part, established the Secret Service Bureau under the Confederate Signal Corps, which managed espionage operations along a clandestine route from Washington to Richmond. They also had a ready-made advantage. Washington, the Union capital, was located only 60 miles south of the Mason-Dixon line and was crawling with Southern sympathizers. Confederate spy networks were active in the capital from the war's very first days. One of the most effective was run by Rose O'Neal Greenhow, a well-connected Washington socialite with deep ties to the political establishment. Greenhow used her access to senior politicians and military officers to gather intelligence on Union troop movements and strategy, which she then passed to Confederate commanders. Her intelligence was reportedly instrumental in the Confederate victory at the First Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861, one of the earliest and most humiliating Union defeats of the war. Just imagine that. A socialite attending dinner parties in the Union capital was funneling battlefield secrets to the enemy, and nobody in the government had any mechanism to detect or stop her. On the Union side, the response to this intelligence threat was, to put it politely, improvised. Since there was no central intelligence organization, individual generals were left to set up their own operations. General George B. McClellan, who had been tapped by Lincoln to command the Army of the Potomac, turned to a man he already knew and trusted, a private detective from Chicago named Allan Pinkerton. Now, Pinkerton was already famous. He had founded the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which was at the time the largest private law enforcement operation in the country. He had foiled an assassination plot against Abraham Lincoln before the president even took office, intercepting a conspiracy to kill Lincoln as his train passed through Baltimore on the way to his inauguration. Pinkerton was bold, resourceful, and deeply patriotic. McClellan put him in charge of intelligence for the Army of the Potomac, and Pinkerton threw himself into the role, adopting the alias Major E.J. Allen and assembling a team of operatives to infiltrate Confederate territory. Pinkerton sent agents deep into the South, including Timothy Webster, one of his most talented detectives, who managed to gain the trust of Confederate officials in Richmond and send back valuable intelligence for months. Webster's cover was so deep that he was trusted by the Confederates themselves, traveling freely between Washington and Richmond. But when Webster fell ill and stopped sending reports, Pinkerton made the fatal mistake of sending 2 other agents to check on him. They were recognized as Union operatives and captured. Under interrogation, they gave up Webster, who was arrested, tried, and hanged. It took 2 attempts with the rope before his life was finally taken, a grim detail that reveals just how brutal the espionage war really was. Kate Warne, one of the first female detectives in American history, also worked for Pinkerton during this period. She posed as a displaced Southern belle, using charm and social connections to extract information from Confederate sympathizers. Pinkerton built a counterintelligence network in Washington, identifying and neutralizing Southern spies, including eventually bringing down Rose Greenhow herself, who was placed under surveillance, arrested, and imprisoned. But there was a massive, crippling problem with Pinkerton's intelligence work, and it is one that illustrates exactly why amateur intelligence operations are so dangerous. Pinkerton consistently and dramatically overestimated the size of Confederate forces. His reports inflated enemy troop numbers by factors of 2 or even 3, telling McClellan that the Confederates had far more soldiers than they actually did. And McClellan, who was already a cautious general by nature, further inflated those numbers himself, using Pinkerton's faulty intelligence as justification for his chronic reluctance to attack. The result was months of strategic paralysis. The Army of the Potomac sat outside Richmond with an overwhelming numerical advantage and did essentially nothing because McClellan believed he was outnumbered. Tens of thousands of lives may have been lost or prolonged because a private detective was not equipped to do the work of a military intelligence professional. When Lincoln finally removed McClellan from command in November of 1862, Pinkerton went with him, and the Union's intelligence apparatus essentially collapsed. It fell to General Joseph Hooker to build something better. Hooker established the Bureau of Military Information under Colonel George Sharp, a New York lawyer who proved to be a far more capable intelligence officer than Pinkerton. Sharp used actual military officers and enlisted men rather than private detectives, developed rigorous methods for corroborating information from multiple sources, and provided commanders with intelligence assessments that were far more accurate and actionable. Under Sharp's leadership, the Bureau of Military Information became one of the most effective intelligence organizations of the war, providing critical support during the Battle of Gettysburg and the final campaigns under Ulysses S. Grant. But once again, the moment the war ended, so did the intelligence operation. The Bureau of Military Information was dissolved, Sharp went back to practicing law, and America, for the second time in its history, dismantled its intelligence capability entirely and went back to pretending it did not need one. Now, to be fair, it was not as if the country had zero intelligence capability in the decades that followed the Civil War. The Office of Naval Intelligence was established in 1882, and the Army's Military Intelligence Division followed in 1885. But these were small, chronically underfunded organizations, focused primarily on gathering open-source information, attending foreign military exercises, reading foreign newspapers, and writing reports that almost nobody read. They were not spy agencies in any meaningful sense. They did not run covert operations. They did not recruit agents. They did not intercept communications. And crucially, there was no coordination between them. The Army, the Navy, and the State Department each operated in their own silos, often collecting the same information independently, sometimes even working at cross purposes, and almost never sharing what they knew with each other. America had entered the modern era with the intelligence apparatus of a second-rate power. This brings us to one of the most colorful and consequential characters in the story of American espionage, a man named Herbert Yardley. Yardley was born in 1889 in Worthington, Indiana, a small town where there was not much to do. He became fascinated with codes and ciphers as a young man, teaching himself cryptanalysis the way other young men of his era taught themselves to hunt or fish. He got a job as a telegraph clerk at the State Department in Washington, where he spent his spare time breaking the codes used in American diplomatic messages just to see if he could do it. He discovered, to his alarm, that the codes the United States was using to communicate with its own embassies abroad were laughably weak. He could crack them in a matter of hours. If he could do it, so could any foreign government with a half-decent codebreaker. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Yardley saw his chance. He convinced the Army to let him establish a dedicated code-breaking unit designated MI8 within the Military Intelligence Division. Yardley was only 28 years old, but he had a remarkable talent for cryptanalysis and an even more remarkable talent for bureaucratic maneuvering. He built MI8 from nothing, recruiting mathematicians, linguists, and puzzle enthusiasts. By the end of the war, his team had cracked the codes of multiple foreign governments. After the armistice, Yardley argued that the United States needed to maintain its code-breaking capability in peacetime. The Army and the State Department agreed, and together they funded what became known as the Black Chamber, officially called the Cipher Bureau. It was located not in Washington, but in a brownstone in New York City, operating under the cover of a commercial code company. This was America's first peacetime signals intelligence organization, and it was astonishingly effective. Between 1919 and 1929, Yardley and his small team broke the diplomatic codes of more than 20 nations. They deciphered over 45,000 foreign diplomatic telegrams from countries including Japan, Argentina, Brazil, Germany, Mexico, and Spain. Their most consequential achievement came in 1921, when Yardley personally cracked the Japanese diplomatic cipher just before the Washington Naval Conference. This conference was a high-stakes negotiation over naval arms limitations, and thanks to Yardley's code-breaking, the American negotiators knew exactly what concessions Japan was willing to make before the Japanese delegates even sat down at the table. The intelligence advantage was decisive. The United States secured a treaty that was far more favorable than it would have been otherwise, and the Japanese never knew their codes had been compromised. But then, in 1929, it all fell apart. President Herbert Hoover appointed a new Secretary of State, Henry Stimson, and Stimson was appalled when he learned about the Black Chamber. Whether or not he actually uttered the famous phrase, "Gentlemen, do not read each other's mail," the sentiment was real and deeply felt. Stimson believed that intercepting foreign diplomatic communications was beneath the dignity of a democratic nation, that it was the kind of thing that despotic European governments did, not the United States of America. He pulled the State Department's funding, and without that support, the Black Chamber was shut down. Yardley was out of a job. What happened next was almost comically reckless. Yardley, unable to find work during the Great Depression and furious at the government for shutting down his operation, sat down and wrote a book about the whole thing. The American Black Chamber, published in 1931, became an immediate bestseller. It revealed in extraordinary detail how the Cipher Bureau had broken the codes of foreign governments, including Japan. The book caused a diplomatic firestorm. 19 nations immediately changed their diplomatic codes. Japan was particularly outraged, and the breach of trust may have contributed to the hardening of Japanese attitudes toward the United States in the decade that followed. Congress responded by passing a law making it illegal for current or former government employees to publish classified cryptographic information, a law that was essentially written specifically to prevent Yardley from writing a sequel. Now, the army did not give up on code-breaking entirely after the Black Chamber was shuttered. William Friedman, a brilliant cryptanalyst who had been working separately from Yardley, continued to build a small signals intelligence capability within the Army's Signal Intelligence Service. Friedman and his team would go on to achieve one of the greatest code-breaking feats in history. In the summer of 1940, they cracked the Japanese purple cipher by actually constructing a replica of the machine the Japanese used to encipher their messages without ever having seen the original device. This breakthrough gave the United States access to Japan's most sensitive diplomatic communications through a program codenamed Magic. It was an extraordinary technical achievement, and it should have been one of America's greatest intelligence assets heading into the coming war. But the breakthrough was undermined by the same structural problem that had plagued American intelligence since the founding of the Republic. There was nobody in charge of the whole picture. The Army and the Navy each had their own code-breaking operations, and they had worked out an absurd arrangement where they took turns decrypting Japanese messages on alternating days. The Army handled the decrypts on even-numbered days, the Navy on odd-numbered days. The decoded messages were distributed to a tiny handful of senior officials, but there was no central analytical staff responsible for pulling the threads together and identifying patterns. And the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, which was responsible for domestic counterintelligence, guarded its information with pathological jealousy, refusing to share it with anyone. This was the state of American intelligence on December 7th, 1941, the day that everything changed. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor killed more than 2,400 American servicemen and civilians, sank or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and drew the United States into the most devastating war in human history. But beyond the immediate military catastrophe, Pearl Harbor represented something even more disturbing. It was one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures any major power had ever experienced. And the painful truth is that the signals were there. Friedman's team was decrypting our Japanese diplomatic traffic. The messages revealed that Tokyo was preparing for major military action and that negotiations with Washington were collapsing. Japanese consulates were gathering detailed intelligence about American naval installations, including Pearl Harbor. A double agent named Dusko Popov, codenamed Tricycle, who British had informed the FBI in August of 1941 that the Germans had tasked him with gathering detailed intelligence about Pearl Harbor on behalf of the Japanese, a clear indicator that an attack was being planned. The FBI buried the report. Hoover did not trust Popov because he was controlled by British intelligence and because Hoover found Popov's personal lifestyle distasteful. The Bureau made no effort to share the information with the military. The fragments of intelligence were scattered across half a dozen agencies, each one holding a piece of the puzzle, and nobody with the authority or the mandate to assemble the complete picture. The result was more than 2,400 people dead, a Pacific fleet in ruins, and a country shocked into the realization that it had been catastrophically unprepared. In the wreckage of Pearl Harbor, the United States finally confronted the truth it had been avoiding since 1783. It needed a real intelligence service, not a bunch of competing bureaucracies tripping over each other, not private detectives working for individual generals, not a single code-breaking unit operating out of a brownstone and subject to the moral whims of whichever Secretary of State happened to be in office. A real, permanent, centralized intelligence agency. Within months, President Franklin Roosevelt took the first steps. He had actually created the position of Coordinator of Information back in July of 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, and appointed a man named William Donovan to fill it. Donovan was one of those larger-than-life characters that American history occasionally produces. A Wall Street lawyer by profession, he had been one of the most decorated soldiers of World War I, earning the Congressional Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Distinguished Service Medal, and 2 Purple Hearts. His men in the trenches of France had called him Wild Bill, a nickname that stuck for the rest of his life. After the war, he served in the Justice Department and then returned to private practice, but he maintained his political connections both at home and abroad. Roosevelt had sent Donovan on intelligence-gathering missions to Europe in 1940 and 1941, where he studied the British intelligence system, particularly the Special Operations Executive, which conducted sabotage and covert operations in occupied Europe. He was also deeply influenced by William Stevenson, the head of British Security Coordination in the United States. Donovan came back convinced that the United States needed its own centralized agency that could gather intelligence, conduct covert operations, and coordinate the intelligence activities of the military services. Roosevelt agreed, and in June of 1942, the Coordinator of Information Office was reorganized, placed under the authority of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and given a new name, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. Donovan built the OSS with a speed and audacity that astonished the Washington establishment, and he did it against fierce resistance from every direction. The military services resented civilian interference in intelligence matters. J. Edgar Hoover saw the OSS as a rival to the FBI and worked actively to undermine it. General Douglas MacArthur refused to allow OSS operatives to set foot in his Pacific Command. But Donovan was relentless. He recruited from everywhere: Wall Street banks, Ivy League universities, Hollywood studios, immigrant communities with knowledge of foreign languages and cultures, even the criminal underworld when their particular skills were needed. He prized initiative and courage above rank or pedigree, saying that he would rather have a young lieutenant with enough guts to disobey a direct order than a colonel too regimented to think and act for himself. He taught his people that they were not afraid to make mistakes because they were not afraid to try things that had not been tried before. The OSS grew to roughly 13,000 men and women at its peak and established more than 40 overseas offices across every continent. Its operations were genuinely extraordinary. Virginia Hall, an American woman who had lost her left leg in a hunting accident, first worked for the British in Vichy, France, where she built an espionage network of over 90 agents. When the Gestapo identified her as one of the most dangerous Allied agents in France, she escaped over the Pyrenees into Spain on her wooden prosthetic, which she had nicknamed Cuthbert. She then joined the OSS and was sent back into France ahead of D-Day, where she organized resistance fighters and coordinated operations behind German lines. She received the Distinguished Service Cross from Donovan personally, the only civilian woman to receive that honor during the war. Alan Dulles ran the OSS station in Bern, Switzerland, and built one of the most productive intelligence networks of the entire conflict. His most valuable source was Fritz Kolbe, a German diplomat who smuggled over 1,600 classified documents to Dulles, providing extraordinary insight into Nazi Germany's war effort and internal politics. Dulles also managed the secret negotiations that led to the early surrender of German forces in Italy, saving potentially thousands of lives on both sides. In Burma, OSS Detachment 101 organized indigenous Kachin fighters into a guerrilla force that killed an estimated 5,400 Japanese soldiers while losing only 15 Americans. In France, teams of OSS and British operatives known as JEDBA teams parachuted behind enemy lines ahead of the Normandy invasion, working with the French resistance to blow up bridges, cut rail lines, and tie down German forces that might otherwise have been deployed against the invasion beaches. But even during the war, there was another intelligence operation running in parallel that almost nobody knew about. It was called the Pond. Created as a purely American operation, deliberately kept separate from the OSS and free from the influence of British intelligence, The pond operated under deep cover for 13 years. It used multinational corporations as fronts, including American Express and Chase National Bank. Its agents ranged from Nazi officials to French criminals. Its records disappeared after it was dissolved, locked in safes in a barn near Culpeper, Virginia, where they sat for over 50 years before being discovered in 2001 and eventually declassified. The pond's existence is a perfect illustration of the fundamental problem. Even during the war, even after the catastrophe of Pearl Harbor had supposedly taught the lesson about the dangers of fragmented intelligence, America was still running competing, uncoordinated spy operations that did not share information with each other. The disease was institutional, and it ran deep. And then, predictably, the moment the war ended, America did what it had always done. On September 20th, 1945, just 18 days after Japan's formal surrender, President Truman signed an executive order dissolving the OSS. Donovan had lobbied hard for a permanent peacetime intelligence agency. He had even drafted a detailed plan for what it might look like. But Truman was suspicious of anything that resembled a secret police. The military services were determined to protect their own intelligence turf, and J. Edgar Hoover was maneuvering to absorb foreign intelligence into the FBI. The OSS was broken apart. Its research and analysis branch went to the State Department. Its operational capabilities were scattered among the military services. Its people went home, taking with them years of irreplaceable expertise. And the country was, once again, essentially blind. But this time, the blindness could not last. The Cold War was already beginning. The Soviet Union was consolidating control over Eastern Europe. Tensions over Germany were escalating. Soviet espionage networks were penetrating Western governments at every level. Truman recognized the danger and created the Central Intelligence Group in January of 1946 as a stopgap measure. Essentially, a clearinghouse for intelligence collected by other agencies. But it was a weak organization, dependent on other agencies for funding, staffing, and information. It had no independent authority and no real teeth. Its senior positions were seen as career dead ends. It took another year and a half of escalating crises, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the growing realization that the Soviet Union was not a partner, but an adversary, before Congress finally acted. On July 26, 1947, President Truman signed the National Security Act, which created the National Security Council, unified the military services under a single Department of Defense, and established the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA officially came into existence on September 18, 1947, 171 years after the Declaration of Independence. But, even then, the law was deliberately vague. There was no mention of espionage or spying in the statute. There was no explicit authorization for covert action. The CIA was described in careful bureaucratic language as a body that would perform services of common concern and carry out such other functions and duties as the National Security Council might direct. Congress included an explicit prohibition against the CIA having any police, subpoena, or law enforcement powers, or internal security functions, a clear signal that lawmakers were terrified of creating an American secret police. It took additional classified directives from the National Security Council in 1947 and 1948 to give the CIA the operational authorities it needed to actually function as an intelligence agency. The turf wars with the FBI, the military intelligence services, and the State Department continued for decades, and in some cases persist to this day. The fundamental tension between the need for centralized intelligence coordination and the American instinct against concentrated power in the shadows has never been fully resolved. Perhaps it never will be. But what makes this entire story so compelling is not just the specific events, the Culper Ring, Pinkerton's inflated numbers, Yardley's code-breaking, the Pearl Harbor disaster, Wild Bill Donovan's audacious experiment. It is the pattern. For 171 years, the United States repeatedly built intelligence capabilities in response to existential threats, used them to survive those threats, and then dismantled them the moment the danger seemed to pass, only to be caught blind when the next crisis arrived. The creation of the CIA was at its core a recognition that America could no longer afford this cycle. That in a world of permanent great power competition, of nuclear weapons and global ideological struggle, the luxury of intelligence amnesia was over. That the ugly, morally complicated, deeply ungentlemanly business of espionage was not a temporary wartime necessity, but a permanent condition of national survival. Whether the CIA has lived up to that mandate, whether the intelligence community has made America safer, or simply more entangled in the world's darkest corners, those are debates that will continue for as long as the agency exists. But the next time someone tells you that the CIA has always been there, that America has always had this massive intelligence machine humming in the background, remember the clothesline on Long Island. Remember the private detective who could not count. Remember the codebreaker whose life's work was shut down because the Secretary of State thought it was rude. Remember the scattered fragments of intelligence that sat in separate filing cabinets on the morning of December 7th, 1941, while Japanese planes were already in the air. The CIA exists because for most of its history, America tried to get by without one, and every single time it paid the price. If you found this one fascinating, please do like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us